So before I go into the presentation itself, some of you might know me better as author of Kevin the Turkey, or I should say co-author. So Pam and I remember Kevin. Raise your hand if you remember Kevin the Turkey. Okay, so handful of... Now what's interesting is in the passage of time, fewer people remember Kevin. And maybe that was one of the reasons we decided to do the book, because we thought, gee, we saw these kids one day. I was the one who had gone by, and I saw them in the school bus, and Kevin's out front, as he often liked to be here, and then stoop in the beech tree across the street. And the kids were all going, "Hi, Kevin, hi, Kevin, hi, Kevin." And I thought, okay, this is pretty cool. Kevin's become a thing. It's multi-generational. This isn't just going to be a bunch of 40-year-olds and above who are snapping pictures and putting it on social media. And it was great. You know, Roger Savick, others he did a photo show. There were a couple turkey figurines out here by the intersection. Somebody dressed it up one across here at the former Masonic Lodge. By the way, how beautiful is it that we finally have a neighbor that's fixing up a building that we've had to look at for decades, fallen into disrepair by neglect. I was on the Historic District Commission for 11 years. And we kept coming and getting applications, retirement home, businesses, even a microbrewery came to us during COVID. And we're like, okay, well, we can't judge on the zoning, but on the optics. And we were really concerned about certain things that would be going on in the front yard, depending on the business. So it sounds like this will be just right, and they're respecting the aesthetics of the building. And as you know, there's already updates on the Dean House, which I oversee as well. Well, what's interesting is, then Kevin is taken away by the state of Connecticut, right? It's a dark van. It's the state of Connecticut. And it's coming down the road, and they brought a giant mirror. I don't know if you know this story, but you know, because I authored the book with Pam, I got all these stories from the post office. They said, oh yeah, they showed up with a giant mirror. Kevin ignores the mirror. They finally said, we're throwing a net, because he had gone out to Jordan Lane, was up on Jersey Divider. Concrete fish, you know. So, and what happens? Of course, it's an early winter storm. It's November. Thanksgiving is approaching, and they're like, hey, he's going to get hit by snowplow, because we all know Kevin. The fire department would try to come out to take care of a 91 accident. Kevin didn't notice that they were wailing on the horns. You'd have other traffic jams here at the intersection as well. So Kevin gets taken away just in time, unfortunately, for Thanksgiving, right in front. I thought, oh no. So we miss him, and it's 2019. I said, Pam, people miss Kevin. We should do a children's book. She goes, let's do it. And we're like, it's gonna be, let's just have fun. So we do it, and we write it on vacation up in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, where my pastor just came from a vacation. And we get the illustrator, who's the seller of our house by Wethersfield Cove, Pam Paterno, and Pam illustrates it. And I said, wheels up, here we go. It's October. We got it out in time for Halloween and Thanksgiving, and people loved it. It was nuts. So we sold 1,000 copies of that book going into the holidays, Christmas, we can say here for sure. And at stores like the one that's across the street. Some of them didn't survive COVID. COVID comes along and everything changed. But we continued to sell it, and we have some. If you missed Kevin the Turkey, the book, we have a few copies. So anyway, I thought I would open with some humor. That's another part of me. If you Google me, you'll see me come up. The talk I'm going to give tonight is by far the most powerful, most personal presentation I've ever given. So I'm already breaking down. I was about to say, be prepared. I'm probably going to break down and cry a few times. So it's partly my Christian journey and how it interweaves with this book. And other than Pam and a handful of friends, I don't know. Some of these stories have never been told before. And some of it pertains to this very space. So without further ado, as we look up, it says faith and freedom. Faith and Freedom is the name of this center of sorts. It's the Blake Center for Faith and Freedom up in Somers, Connecticut, where my Hillsdale College was able to have a center created. God works in mysterious ways. I grew up here in Connecticut. nowhere near here. I was in Fairfield and then Litchfield County. And my father was an architect, so we moved around and loved old houses. So my dad did make it to Wethersfield once. He was like, wow, look at all these old houses. So along comes Hillsdale College, and I'm thinking, we're marooned here in the Northeast. My college in Michigan really didn't know what was going on in the Northeast. Yeah, we had donors, but that was about it. And then along came the Blake family, Press and his wife, who he and his brother had co-created Friendly's Ice Cream back in 1936 as Friendly. Didn't even have an S yet. This was in Springfield, Mass. And you used to see the Rolls Royces going around without anything on them except the chassis and a seat. He creates Friendly's, and then he's 102 years old and says, gee, what's my legacy? I'd like it to go to Hillsdale. Now, Hillsdale gets these offers all the time behind the scenes. And the lawyer even said that when he made our presentation at Somers in Planning and Zoning. But this was one they couldn't refuse. And so we Hillsdale College, basically made an agreement to acquire a 100-acre property that includes the perfect reproduction of Mount Vernon from the outside, Thomas Jefferson's Mount Vernon. Different inside, of course, kitchens and baths. But at any rate, my point here is that it's amazing how God works. And so that's why I wanted to call it Faith and Freedom. I'm actually borrowing it from the Blake Center, because they call it the Blake Center for Faith and Freedom. And I love alliteration, which is why my book is called Portraits of Patriots. It just punches. And I also say my Christian journey in my book with Portraits of Patriots. So it's several things blended together. And now these images and what they mean. So that's me and Pam on the left in the steeple with Pastor Todd. He's taking the photo. And if you've ever been up there, that's about as many people as you're going to get, 3, maybe 4, right? I remember coming and speaking to your steeple committee a couple years ago because, like I mentioned, I was on the Historic District Commission here for 11 years, so I know what we look for in our applications and the challenges that you faced because my dad was an architect. On the right is a shot. I got a double selfie of me and Pam in the burying ground out here that my friend Bruce and others help manage. And that is us with Patriot Samuel Hamner. He is the patriot who owned our house, built it in 1765. He was a cooper, so he made barrels that they would put on the ships in the cove. He was in the Battle of New York 250 years ago this summer, so that's kind of cool, goosebumps, that our local community got on a sloop in the cove and sailed down the Connecticut River. Can you imagine this kind of heat, what that was like? And so that's us silhouetted around sunset. And I said, Pam, this will be the perfect shadow portrait against his headstone. Isn't that sweet? That's the cover of my book. And the reason I did this book was that I realized, gee, no one's really written about the general in the upper left corner, General Jedediah Huntington, who knew the Webbs and Silas Deane. Nor had they written much about the wife besides her artwork, and that's her just below him, Faith Trumbull Huntington, daughter of Governor Jonathan Trumbull Sr., nor her brother, Jonathan Jr., just beneath with his wife, Elizabeth Backus, nor Jedediah Huntington's younger half-brother, Ebenezer, in his uniform. By the way, all of these were painted by John Trumbull. And then at the bottom, not painted by John Trumbull, but later was, Samuel Webb of Wethersfield, right? Grew up right across the street. I'm looking out at his house right now. And they were all subsidiary in even though they were more senior officers, it is John Trumbull, the painter, who is the largest face on the cover, because I realized most people like yourselves are going to recognize him. John Trumbull, oh yes, the painter. Yes, painter of Patriots from the American Revolution, but what else? Colonel John Trumbull, because he had served in the American Revolution, including in combat, something I didn't know until 10 years ago when I bought his sister's house, when we bought it in 2015 in Norwich. And so that's why I subtitled it Colonel John Trumbull and 5 Fellow Patriots from Connecticut in the American Revolution. By the way, this is so fun to look at Pastor Todd and Pastor Tucker, because I'm always thinking of you guys up here. How do you do it without notes? My mother-in-law was a minister, Yale Divinity School. Always marveled at that, and you'll notice historians don't need notes either. We're divinely inspired, I'd like to imagine. And we have some little cheat sheets. So there is us on the day of our wedding on the left. So I say, Pam and I here at First Church, we're married and we'll be buried. Isn't that a clever rhyme? So married October 25th, and we'll be buried here someday, God willing. This is our wedding on October 25th. For those of you who remember Jay Deifel, of course that's him on the right, and then standing where I am now. And notice, unusually, we're all in colonial garb because, as you know, the choir could have them, rented basically for folks like our family and friends who said, we want to get into costume. And 30 of us were reenactors in this anyway, so I'm in my Rev War uniform, and Pam is in her French silk d'anglais or whatever, and there's Jay playing along, as did David. David even he was sitting up there with his wig on. Jay comes to the front door. He looks more nervous than me. I had already gone to the police and said, hey, Chief, Citron. I said, we're going to be shooting muskets. Is that okay? Sure, that's fine. Okay, cool. Do we need to shut down the road? No, that's cool. Everybody will figure it out. I said, all right, let's go with that. I'm not bringing a cannon because I realized we don't want to break any windows from the shockwaves. So we parade down. Now, we're all in the parade, and we have a bunch of cameras rolling, and people are taking photos. So we don't know that what's happened, and you could say cosmically this was time travel. Apparently we were in a wormhole because the power was going out without us realizing it as we left our house and came here. So that when I arrived, Jay looked more ashen and stressed than I did. I said, what's wrong? They're sticking a lavalier mic on me, muskets are all pointed, He goes, you're not going to believe what happened. I said, what, Jay? So the power just came back on after it had been off for the last 30 minutes. I said, see? Now, if you saw the movie American Miracle last summer, which I rewatched last night just to remind me of some of the things I want to mention over the next 45 minutes, it was cosmic that the power went out because it's like you're back in the 18th century, but we didn't know. So we arrive, and of course, the funny part is David Spicer saying, no problem, I was ready with a harpsichord. And I said, and what would the problem be, right? Harpsichord, pipe organ? We're fine, because the music was all 18th century anyway. So that would have been an interesting, fun challenge. There is a view that you've never seen before. There's Pam looking depressed, so sorry that she's going to be balled and chained to me for the rest of her life. And Ben Franklin by her side, which is her cousin, looking like, I guess, Ben Franklin, an engineer from California. And then there's the shot that one of the photographers took from above, and that was amazing. The most magical moment was when Reverend Jay Deifel had us hold hands. So we had a kneeler here for us to kneel. And he said, I want you to all close your eyes. Do you do this at weddings? I'm just curious. I thought it was beautiful. He said, everyone close your eyes. Turn the cameras off. So we all close our eyes. And then he said a prayer, and it was so beautiful. That's the most magical moment. Yep. And the best part was, I liked that the video camera guy didn't turn it off. So we had that moment caught on camera. He was right over here. So beautiful. And then, as you know, Jay retired soon after. But there we are, all in colonial attire. Everyone with the soldiers. I said, you have to leave your muskets in the vestibule. Some of you knew Sal Carmesino. We like to joke when he would play Silas Dean, Sal as Dean instead of Silas Dean. So there's Sal, who tragically was killed in a car accident a couple years ago, and then some other friends of ours in various attire. This is our stairway to heaven, I call it. I called Pastor Todd and I said, Silas Dean got a tour from John Adams in the spring of 1774 up to the steeple. And John Adams liked to really pour it on dramatically in his diary. He would say things like he did the same thing when he traveled through Windsor. I think he visited Oliver Ellsworth. He says, behold, the greatest landscape that God ever created. Here it is, God's land and the greatest, most wonderful soil for harvesting. So he came to Wethersfield. He said, behold, from atop the steeple of Wethersfield First Church is the greatest view I've ever beheld. I was like, wow, okay. So we put that in the church program. Well, there's the view. Sorry you can't see the cove and couldn't see our house, but there's not a drone view of across the street and then the cemetery. It's really amazing to see that. Pam is on what we call the ship's ladder. It's like something in the Navy. If you've been in the surface force, you know what this looks like, but it's wood. And there we are going up. So we appreciate that wonderful historic opportunity. It was really magical. So it's ominous, and this even happened at our wedding, when you have a web of patriots, or amongst us Christians, you also have traitors. And so we always speak of God as being omnipresent, but so is Satan. And I think C.S. Lewis in Screwtape Letters reminds us of that. And I'm sure there's some great Bible verses that remind us of that. And so there's the Sturm und Strang, there's the ebb and the flow, there's the constant struggle between light and dark in our daily lives. And it includes my journey, because yes, I was baptized Christian. My mom was Catholic, my dad was Episcopalian. She said, sign these papers so that I'm Catholic. And that was on September 11th. What's more evil than what occurred on September 11th? And I was 30 years old that day teaching history. And my examples for this community in the American Revolution include several. Sergeant Thomas Hickey. You've probably never heard of Thomas Hickey. He is in my book. He lived in Wethersfield. He was born and raised in Ireland, came here to the United States sometime in the 1760s. And we know that this is Sergeant Thomas Hickey, the Patriot soldier, because he's the only Thomas Hickey living in Connecticut at the time. And that time is the American Revolution. And he will sign an account book of Samuel Hamner, the cooper, whose house we own. He will become infamous because he is in George Washington's lifeguards. George Washington's lifeguards are effectively his secret service while he is commander-in-chief of the U.S. Army. They were created soon after he arrived in Boston. The Continental Army is created 250 years ago, so summer of 1775. And he needs for the protection. We've already had one traitor, someone named Dr. Benjamin Church, who winds up briefly imprisoned in Norwich and Litchfield, Connecticut. And Benjamin Church probably was the most high-ranking doctor slash, multi-talented individual to be arrested until Benedict Arnold, because he was inner circle. He was part of the brains of the Patriots in Boston. He was leaking secrets to General Gage in Boston. But Thomas Hickey is often overlooked, and because he's in Wethersfield, I have to mention him. Because there's an assassination plot on George Washington and Israel Putnam 250 years ago this month. So, in the summer of 1776, specifically May into June, Governor Lee Tryon of New York City and his cohorts, Dave Matthews, not the band member, but Dave Matthews, mayor of New York City, and others were involved in hatching a plot that they would try to capture or kill George Washington and Israel Putnam. Israel Putnam at that point was considered the number 2 general. He was the major general in New York City. Within months, he'll become much less important in the war, but he was a hero of Bunker Hill, a Connecticut legend, including the French and Indian War. And so at that point, he's the one they're going to try to capture besides Washington. Well, what happens is Thomas Hickey had been arrested, even though he was on Washington's lifeguard. Among the charges was counterfeiting, and it turned out that John Jay, our famous eventual founding father, who basically gets credit for the CIA for co-creating counterintelligence in the American Revolution, he had informants tell him that Thomas Hickey was basically the operator who would carry out this horrible plot. He and another bodyguard named Michael Lynch, and possibly a third, a drummer, were going to, at some point, apprehend and possibly kill George Washington if he resisted. Same difference for Israel Putnam. And this is all in New York City. Again, June of 1776. The plot is foiled. John Jay will put them on trial, he and 2 other judges, so that there could, in theory, be a 2-1 vote. There was not. It was a 3-0 vote. But Thomas Hickey is condemned to be hanged as a traitor, and he is not only condemned, but he will be hanged. And the reason to that is that George Washington wants to set an example that if you're going to be a traitor and you're the ringleader, or in this case the lead plotter, we're going to commit this punishment upon you. A lot of times, if you were not hanged, you were whipped. And for every time someone was hanged, there were 100 soldiers who were whipped. Okay, so many, many soldiers were whipped during the American Revolution for the various infractions. 10 whips, let's say, is the first time for some minor stealing. More serious theft or sexual assault or some other heinous crime, it got up towards 100 lashes, and of course the men would pass out. So they weren't always going to be shot by musket volley, that was an option, or hanged. They were usually lashed up to 100 times. And this is all in the letters. So that's Thomas Hickey's story. So Thomas Hickey's story is proven to have happened through two sources, and one of them is Samuel Webb of Wethersfield, and we'll see his picture momentarily. Samuel Webb is told by Silas Deane, the Yellow House, keep a diary, son, because you're not going to remember everything that happens. It's going to get crazy. And the one time he does makes a diary entry of something important is when he learns of the plot. He had just come from being aide-de-camp for General Putnam to then serve as General George Washington's aide-de-camp. So he knows both generals. And he said, today the blackest die, treason was foiled by the efforts of John Jay and others. And he gives a couple more lines and that's it. Same difference in Major General William Heath's diary. He's a Major General from Boston. George Washington doesn't say anything about it in his. He has an off and on diary. It's mostly accounting and weather conditions. Well, at any rate, there's another person who you could say was cursed by Satan, overtaken by Satan. That's Silas Deane's student. We all know that Silas Deane is our most famous Wethersfield person of all time, arguably. That's why we have a highway named after him. We even have a pawn shop named after him. But we want to remember him as a patriot leader, right? He's a diplomat. His relations with France are important. Does he have a difficult relationship or a complicated relationship with Congress? Yes. But that's because of Arthur Lee, not because Deane was entirely not patriotic. He had a more complex relationship with Arthur Lee, who framed him for a lot of things he did not actually commit, like embezzlement. And another was one of Deane's students early in life, Edward Bancroft. Edward Bancroft was from Hartford, and this is him as an adult in the black and white shot that you're looking at. And Silas Deane is a tutor to him because, like a lot of people, Deane had gone to places like Yale and Harvard, and they would take a young talent like Edward Bancroft at 12 and 14 years old and prepare them for school at places like Yale. Bancroft was a star student. Now the American Revolution has broken out. Bancroft is with Benjamin Franklin in Paris. Franklin is a little suspicious of Bancroft and realizes he's probably informing the British. In fact, he was definitely informing the British, sending secret messages through the gardens of this palace in France. And the problem is that Bancroft might have also engaged in, shall we say, chemical warfare or an assassination. He is alleged, we have no proof, to have possibly poisoned Silas Deane as Deane was embarking from London to come back to the United States around the time the American Revolution was ending. I don't remember exactly what year Deane dies, but there's one possibility. If you read the Bancroft biography from a professor, there's some circumstantial evidence because Bancroft was knighted by King George for being amazing with the chemical compounds of plants, and that can include poisons. So there's some circumstantial evidence, but no proof. And then finally, a face that you're going to instantly recognize by the name and not the face, and it's in color, and that's Benjamin Talmadge. That's him as a major, later lieutenant colonel, miniature portrait that I've held at Litchfield Historical Society. He's living in Wethersfield as schoolmaster. He's in charge of, call it Wethersfield High School, before the American Revolution breaks out. His buddy, his classmate, Nathan Hale, is doing the same thing down in New London. They're writing to each other. Gee, the girls are really kind of cute here in Wethersfield. Hale's like in Essex, not having such a great time, or East Haddam, moves to Groton and is having a much nicer time in New London and Groton. Talmadge is running the school here. The war breaks out. He's a cavalry officer. They begin their training on Wethersfield Broad Street Green. You might know the marker, in 1777. In 1778, George Washington will enlist him in the secret services to become a spy, and you could say a case officer. And so he is. He's a case officer for this spy ring known as the Culper spy ring. And Benjamin Talmadge will leave Wethersfield, go as a cavalry officer down to Fairfield County, Westchester County, but he grew up in Long Island. So if you know anything about the Culper ring, it's operating through Setauket, Long Island, over to Fairfield, Connecticut, where I grew up. So the courier for that ring for Talmadge was his old friend Caleb Brewster, who's buried across the street from my childhood home. It's a very small world. So that's the reason why, married to a psychologist, I got into the American Revolution, is because Talmadge's Culper ring came through my town, and it was the bicentennial when I was a little kid. So I was like, this is cool. This is an amazing story. Well, Talmadge is living here in Wethersfield. And do you know the interesting thing, that like sort of satanic thing, but I'm going to use a Star Wars reference, sorry, but I'm going to, and that is that Benedict Arnold was a lot like Anakin Skywalker. Anakin Skywalker then becomes Darth Vader, to those of you not familiar with the character. Anakin Skywalker was a tremendously intelligent young fictional character who goes to the dark side. As talented as he was as a Jedi Knight, he becomes this incredibly notorious, what would you say, political assassin and dark leader, right, working for the Emperor. Well, what is Benedict Arnold? Tremendously young, bright, I want to get technically here on the Star Wars stuff, high midichlorian count. In other words, his IQ was incredible. Mike's laughing. So what happens is that Arnold will switch sides. And I've given presentations about the traitorous activities of Arnold because they're more complex than have even been told in books. And Arnold is going to write a letter to Benjamin Talmadge addressed to his address here in Wethersfield after he commits the treason. And he basically says, I know you're the case officer to a spy ring. So if you want, come on over to the dark side. Isn't that terrible? But that was Arnold. He had no feelings of remorse. He even said to George Washington, please take care of my dear wife, Peggy. She's completely innocent in this. Maybe. We don't know. So going back, to put it back in spiritual terms on this diversion I just took, God and my book. God's timing is clever. I mean, as I've become older and wiser, it is amazing when you listen to him, God, how clever he is. It is just so incredible how he pulls it off. And as you're listening to that wavelength, that wordless communication, it's incredible. If we have time later, I'm definitely going to break down at the end. If we have time at the end, and I'll tell you my personal, if you will, born-again experience. So God's time is clever. Another one is, and this is a two-part quote, Pam came up with a quote, my wife, wait for God's timing. And then I added to that within hours, yes, and you will be rewarded. And it's so true. And I can feel that with this whole process of the book and the whole journey. Look at this date, Friday, March 13th, 2020. We all remember the day or that weekend. The country is shutting down. We're all watching the news. Italy, Spain, Iran, they're all dropping like flies. And we know that we're probably next, and we're going to have to scramble and do everything we can. We know the first person's coming in from the Pacific Northwest has just died. Now it's March 13th. We're pretty much have to grin and bear it. I had an appointment already made a month earlier with the Pennsylvania Historical Society in downtown Philadelphia. And it was to look into the pay stubs of blacks who were not enslaved, but were paid to be labor on a ship built, ironically enough, in Norwich, Connecticut on Mohegan land. I also wanted to see the, indigenous or Native American Mohegan names on there, maybe some Manchituckets. I did, so Pam and I were pulling out the archive boxes and photographing anything we could. And I came up with an expression called partnership and patriotism because I realized before the upheaval that would come in 2020, here I am later that year, March of 2020, I said, Pam, there's such positivity here because these people were paid to help build the ship. And what could be the most ironic, awkward name for the ship for all these diverse people of color to help build? The Confederacy. The ship is named the Confederacy. And of course, it has nothing to do with the Civil War. It's 1777. It's launched in 1779. Why is it the Confederacy? We're not fighting the South. Oh, it's the Articles of Confederation, which of course is the model of government that we had ratified in 1779 by Congress. Congress has no power to tax. Articles of Confederation are kind of a failure. And then of course that's why we achieve what we're eventually going to have in this 250th which is the U.S. Constitution. Now, for all of you who are thinking, oh my God, the 250th, the high water mark, what are we to do? The sky's going to fall or whatever after this weekend, July 4th, and then it's all over. I tell people, it's not a year, it's a smear. And get ready, because 2033 will be big. Trust me, New York City, it's going to be nuts, because that is always their evacuation day, just like Boston celebrates for 1775. And then you're going to have the Constitution, and everyone's going to be getting around the Constitution and doing that for years, okay? The ratification, which will come in 2037 into 2038, if we're also lucky to even be here. So, who knows? Maybe if we wait for God on that, we will be rewarded. But there it was. It's March 20th, 2020. Where do we go on Sunday, the 15th? And we're like, we got to go. It's too important. It's in the book that I'm going to be writing. Valley Forge. Now, I wasn't thinking like we're going to go to Valley Forge because the country is shutting down to this horrible pandemic. But my goodness, what an amazing coincidence. It's COVID-19. Yeah, I know it's going to be kind of a big deal, but we wind up at Valley Forge, which is the epicenter of disease and death in the American Revolution. You can bring up any battle or siege you want, Saratoga, Yorktown, whatever you want, Bunker Hill. The worst loss of life for the Americans, the highest rate of death was for the British at Bunker Hill. Worst until they had the Battle of Somme in 1916. They lost several hundred soldiers that morning. Aside from that, on the American side, we did not have the rate of death until Valley Forge because of disease, malnutrition, and other things related to, gee, you may not want to relieve yourself 5 feet from where you're going to be living, right? So we didn't know the science of encampments at that point, and so smallpox inoculation hadn't yet occurred. That soon will. And if you remember the movie The American Miracle that came out last summer, Michael Medved says in there, George Washington contracts smallpox when he's young. His brother Lawrence is going to die of his own disease down in Barbados, I think it was, in the Caribbean. Washington gets smallpox. What's going to be the disease that ravages so many soldiers in the American Revolution? Smallpox. He's already immune because he's already had it and survived. That's going to be pretty amazing, among other things that movie brings up. So we're there, and the next day, the country, of course, closed down. So if I had made that appointment for Monday instead of March 13th, I don't have those notes. I don't have the pay stubs, and I would have had to wait maybe a year and a half to get back in to see them. And now I'm in conversation with the Mohegans in such a beautiful way about what I've discovered over the years. So one door closes and another opens, and that definitely happened because I started typing on this laptop. And on a really hot day like today, I'll tell you, I was in the pool. I'd be up to here, and I'd have the the laptop, and I literally would be typing. There'd be a book or some website or something, or sometimes I'd have two laptops. Yeah, okay, doing this. I kept typing, and to put it in religious terms, I got so focused, you could say I was channeled by the Holy Spirit to not bother to keep a word count. I don't keep a word count. September 23, it's been 3.5 years. Because you look, March of 2020 to September 23, I said, gee, I got a lot of chapters, and I really need to start thinking about what I'm going to do with all this. I know, I'll call the most famous author I have the phone number for, Nathaniel Philbrick. He's been to my house, he's been here, he spoke here. I said, Nat, Damien. I said, I got a question. What do I do with all this manuscript? How do I submit it to a publisher? How many words do you have? Great question, Nat. I have no idea. I'll call you back in a week. I go back and I count them up. I had 200,000 words. That's enough for 2 books. I was like, wow, I'm pretty blessed to have that. I call him back. He said, yeah, you have a very good problem on your hands. Sounds like you're going to have to make it into 2 books. So I did. So the first book I published, and again, Satan would say, for you who have read Screwtape Letters, Uncle Screwtape comes along now, my dear Wormwood, it would really be good to get into Damien's psyche and frustrate him as a first-time author and have him rejected by the publishing companies he writes to. So that's what happened. I met with these guys face-to-face at conferences. This is not a cold call or an email. I'm saying to this person, and they're saying back to me, I love your writing on fill in the blank magazine, such as Journal of the American Revolution. What about my book? The emails never get returned. They would just say, not interested in doing your manuscript into a book. I'm like, what the heck is going on? And it's a day like today where I can finally look back and say, because God wanted me to create a book that I would have complete control over. And I had already created the publishing company, P&D Creative, with Pam for Kevin the Turkey. So I thought, okay, well, that was kind of a skirmish or warm-up band to this. It's going to be pretty intense. I don't have any marketing plan. Graphic designer, I need one of those. Got a graphic designer in New Jersey through my network of author friends. He's terrific. He came up with the cover design with my consultation. What am I rewarded with? Everything I do and I pour into it, I get back. Now, it's not about profit loss, but let's face it, I'm in the black. The money I put into the book that Pam and I did, she's my editor, we know that we've already done well, and a book sells every day on Amazon, but that's not the point. The real point is, I know that these are people who I'm never going to meet who are going to read my book. I know that because my book is on Amazon and on YouTube and now with this church talk, this version, this unique version, I've never given this version of my talk before, will always be out there in the digital dust. And I think that's a beautiful thing, because I wanted to have a legacy as a historian, and I felt I wasn't getting enough of that as a teacher. I knew that I had made a positive impact on young adolescents, but the teaching in 2001, including the morning of 9/11, was not like when I went to high school in 1986. Boy, did I have no idea. I got out right before smartphones and the internet were taking over the classrooms, with texting and all of that. I had never had a text interrupt my class in 2001. That's going to happen a lot by 2005, but I'm already out the door at that point. So the clever timing of it all. This is the family tree. I knew that every time people encounter all these Trumbles and Huntingtons, their brain starts to spin. And they go, oh no, what do I do? So I have these family trees up. And what it does is it shows you the Trumbles and the Huntingtons. Now I can't zoom in, but you can imagine in the center of the tree is the merger of the two families, Jedediah Huntington and Faith Trumbull. They are the husband and wife, the first man and lady of our house that we buy. And even that's crazy, like wait for God's timing, you'll be rewarded. We looked at, 75 houses? From Salisbury in the northwest corner to my childhood town of Fairfield to Stonington. The only thing we didn't do is go up to like Pomfret. And we're looking at all these houses, and why is it that we have this house? We had closed on the Benjamin Talmadge house in Litchfield. It was a done deal. The bank said, you're buying the house. Congratulations, it's 2011. We never bought the house. The deal falls through because the bank buys out the bank that we had done the mortgage with. My childhood bank. They knew my parents growing up. I'm like, Pam, did we just get cursed or did we just dodge a bullet? And you wait, and you wait. That was 2011, and then it's 2015, we get Jedediah Huntington's house. And it just is amazing how it works out. Sometimes it could take years, so sometimes we have to be patient as Christians to wait for God's timing. So there's Jedediah and Faith. And then you see the prominent parents. Governor of Connecticut for Faith's father. His father was Jabez, who knew everybody across the street because he was a member of the General Assembly and a very wealthy man. When these two were 23 years old, Jedediah and Faith, the house that we had was built for them when they were 23 years old as newlyweds in 1765, and it's 5,000 square feet. Like, what do you do with all of that? And yet, that's what they were able to have built for them, which is amazing. And then you see their siblings, including John Trumbull off to the lower right. I had a traumatic childhood. I grew up in a comfortable family in Fairfield, but it wasn't without its challenges, including the fact that my mom was a Navy nurse who wanted to write a book, an autobiography about her traumatic life. She dies before she wrote it. Dies at 59 while I'm a senior at Hillsdale College. They pull me out of class. So that's why I relate to John Trumbull. He had childhood traumas. I fell down a staircase when I was 2. He fell down a staircase when he was 7. I wasn't blinded, he was. So Connecticut's own famous painter grows up in this house that Christy here knows all so well. And it's the Governor Trumbull house. Well, sort of, Governor Jonathan Trumbull Sr., but the plaque here on the front of the house says something else. It's the birthplace of Colonel John Trumbull, the portrait painter. And so we always have to wrestle with how do we identify this house to realize the National Park Service is showing something that Dad would have been like, really? And we'll get to that in a minute. But there's John in his second selfie. The kids would say selfie. Here's the self-portrait. There's John in 1777. Do you know he's self-taught at this point? He has no classroom, no formal teaching yet. And yet he's able to do such a beautiful painting like the one on my cover. He came so close to never being a painter in his life. Here are the reasons. And by the way, his peers include, I put Ralph Earl, died to alcohol poisoning, alcoholic in Bolton. Gilbert Stewart, born and raised in Kingston, Rhode Island, go see his house. And Charles Wilson Peale of Philadelphia. John Trumbull's right there. In his childhood, he would have two tragedies that he would talk about in his autobiography that he published before he died in 1843. He's one of the last great patriots of the American Revolution to be alive when he dies in 1843. One is that he is suffering from chronic seizures. It's the late 1740s, early 1750s. Needless to say, medicine is at best quirky in our eyes. You know, there's bloodletting and leeches and other things, molasses and all these other crazy things they would do. The doctor says to the mother, published, seen here in the lower right, painted by her son years later, you're going to massage his brain. Now, my mom was a Navy nurse, so I found this very powerful to read. That will reduce the seizures over time. And they did. The seizures do go away from 1754 to 55 or whatever the years were. It's amazing. Overcomes the seizures. That's not it. Here we go next. Back hall of this house, the back wing. Sisters are roughhousing. They're teenagers, 13, 14. John's like, that rambunctious little 5, 6, 7-year-old. He's in the servant staircase, the back staircase, falls down the staircase, and doesn't realize until he's squinting a week or two later, oh wow, I'm blind in one eye. So what's an inspiring story that I try to share in the book is you may have these seizures, you may even become blind in one eye, but that doesn't mean you're not going to be able to transcend what your dad had planned for you, and that is, son, you're going to be a minister. But he's not. The father says, I want you to go into the ministry, and if you're not going to do that, then you will be a reputable lawyer. What does the rambunctious young John say? Dad, I'm not like my brothers. I'm not like David or Jonathan Sr. or the others, Joseph. I want to be different. Okay, kid, what do you have in mind? Because you're going to Harvard and you're going to just study divinity anyway and learn your Greek and Hebrew and everything else. I want to be a painter. Now, a lot of times people would say, kid, I get it, you're a little talented, but what does the father say to him? And I love how Walt Woodward puts this. And I can't imitate Walt, but here we go, the outgoing state historian a few years ago. John, the family called him Jack, because remember now, Dad is Jonathan Sr., brother of John is Jonathan Jr., and then there's John. So they called John Jack, thank God. So in the house, when you're yelling, at least we know we're referring to the younger brother. He says, Jack, Connecticut is not Athens. Meaning your art career is not going to be that which would put you on an international stage. Really. Because right there, that plaque says, birthplace of John Trumbull Painter, not the governor's mansion. So we think of it as the governor's mansion. But John proved his father right. So that's an interesting life lesson as well, that we empower the youth, that if they're called by God, we would say, to be talented in the visual arts, give the kid a chance. Let him blossom. The father, in his childhood, had this occur, and I wanted to show this because Pam being a trauma psychologist. Jonathan Jr. had high expectations on reading for his sons at Harvard. He expressed these sentiments along with his strong Christian faith in a letter in 1753 to a Mr. Marsh, one of Jonathan's tutors at Mr. Tisdale School. This was the prep school of its day in Lebanon, Connecticut. Quote, I do not mean to send them to college to spend their time in my estate in a careless, idle, and foolish manner. No spring breaks at Fort Lauderdale, right? But in hopes that they may thereby become better qualified for service and usefulness to themselves and others in such relation and capacity as divine providence may place them in the world. Well, isn't it a beautiful thing that God had plans for John Trumbull? And his father couldn't even have understood it until years later. So that son Jack will become the most prominent member of the family, and his brother becomes governor just like the father, Jonathan Jr., does. And that's why Yale is so special, having the John Trumbull collection. Who inspired John Trumbull to be the painter he became? He says in his memoirs, my older sister by 9 years, Faith. And again, we own her house. For decades, this is crazy, we did not know what John Trumbull's sister, Faith, looked like. The last time anyone knew for sure was the 1920s, and it was the DAR that at that time somehow had received this painting in miniature done by an unknown painter, unknown year. I believe it was done around 1757 in Boston. Lots of painters in Boston in the 1750s, who knows? She's about 12 or 13, and a Wikipedia volunteer finds her buried in an old DAR magazine. Now, what's interesting about the Daughters of American Revolution, for those of you who are not members or closely associated like I am as past president of the SAR, the DAR have very high standards. They know exactly what they're doing in their research, most of the time. This lady, this girl, disappears into their own magazine archives, so that by 1930, they attributed this image as her mother, not her. So they say Faith Robinson Trumbull as a girl. It's not. It's not. Furthermore, she looks like her father, Jonathan the governor. And if we were to line up the family tree and have time to get into facial recognition software, I could show that to you. But at any rate, in the fall of 2024, in the wake of the terrible hurricanes down in Asheville, North Carolina, and elsewhere, Pam and I were there contributing some relief supplies to some churches. I said, I'm going to get on Wikipedia because I know that Faith died around this time. I have to check. It's around Thanksgiving. And up came the image. I still have to thank the volunteer. How do we get this image to color and looking like a woman 20 years later? I called my Hillsdale College buddy and I said, Derek, you're great with computers. When you've got some spare time and you're not doing your corporate security, would you mind taking Faith and using your AI software and aging her and putting her in color? He said, sure, no problem. I didn't even think of the coincidence of red, white, and blue, but that's how it came out. Because Pam said, well, we're going to have blue in the background because it doesn't show her dark hair if it's all red. Well, look, it's red, white, and blue. How cool is that? And then Pam says, oh, and one other thing, put the miniature portrait of her husband, Jedediah, in her necklace. That's clever. So he does. And it comes in as a text on the phone, and Pam and I were just pouring with tears how beautiful it was. And you'll find out why momentarily, because she indeed had been forgotten. The DAR even hired a professional artist to do a fictional on their website. And it's on the website still. We still have to work on getting Wikipedia and the DAR to merge because now we know what she looked like. Here are Faith's embroideries, and you can see why John Trumbull, as a 5- and 7-year-old, said, gee, my 12 to 15-year-old sister is doing this with her thumbs instead of Twitter and Instagram. That's pretty amazing. Look at these. So we have reproductions of these. The last time I broke down several times in a talk was when I gave a talk where these are stored. You know it as the Connecticut Historical Society, new name during COVID, which I had to edit, Connecticut Museum of History, right? Connecticut Museum of Culture, History and Culture, yeah. So I had to rebrand it, but these are 2 of the 3 over mantles, meaning over a fireplace. One of them is about 6 feet wide. When Nat Philbrick came into the house, he goes, my goodness, this is impressive. I said, it's just the reproduction. It's meant to trick the eye. Unfortunately, Faith in 1775 suffered from severe depression. We have no indication that she had been pregnant and then miscarried. It's possible, but there's no evidence for that. We don't know what child she had other than a son who you're going to meet momentarily, who she gave birth to in 1767. But she's pretty depressed. And John Trumbull says in his memoirs, published in the 1830s, my sister was chronic depression. She was a woman of great Christian faith, but she just could not get through her depression. And so letter after letter, 7 of which I transcribed for the first time at the Connecticut State Library in Hartford 5 years ago, indicated her depression. There were times where she'd feel better and then she would relapse. And she was getting treated here in Wethersfield. She'd come up, hey, let's cheer her up. She could visit the in-laws at the Webb and the Chesters. Her sister-in-law was one of the Chester wives. Didn't work. A few days later, she'd lapse back in. So she's up at this house in Dedham, Massachusetts. And what happens? Her depression becomes so severe that when George Washington changed a leave for Thanksgiving, it set her off. At that Thanksgiving in 1775, the plan was that most of the officers, if they had local contacts, could retire to the houses to celebrate Thanksgiving with their loved ones. And so her brothers, John Trumbull and another brother, Joseph, and one of her brother-in-laws, and her husband, Jedediah, who were all there on this siege of Boston in the fall of 1775, were told, you can't go home, you can't get leave, because there's rumors of an imminent British attack. She's so worried, John Trumbull says, that my sister assumed that they were all going to be killed or at least wounded. She hanged herself that night in the barn behind the house. She's an incredibly strong Christian. If we had more time, I'd take you through all of her letters. And we've theorized maybe she felt somehow she could justify she'd be closer to God at some kind of liberation angle. And everyone had to wrestle with it as New England Congregationalists. I mean, we're talking the Puritan family tree here. So how do we handle the issue of mental health and suicide? During a war, no less. And we'll get to that in a minute. It's so ironic because her name is Faith. Did she put her ultimate faith in God, or was there something else? We don't know. So Dr. Sprague thought he was going to be able to cure her. It obviously didn't work. And then you can imagine that she's going to be buried, and the funeral is a Christian funeral. They don't cover up the cause of her death, and there will be obituaries, eulogies published in several newspapers. I'm going to read some selections here. For 1 second, I just want to jump, because it was 250 years ago. Her wake and funeral is at this house. George Washington will visit that house just months later on April 4th. 4 days later, he's in our neighborhood in Norwich. So he goes from where Faith Trumbull had committed suicide and had her wake service to being at her husband, her widower's father's house in Norwich. It's an amazing, odd coincidence. This house still stands, by the way, just like ours in our neighborhoods. That one's up in Dedham, Mass, in a historic district. And this is what it said. The obituary was printed in both the Connecticut Gazette and Providence. An unnamed author, perhaps her husband Jedediah or her father, the governor, praised Faith for having a multitude of attributes, including her being virtuous, amiable, pious, and modest. One part praised her by saying, quote, and although by divine providence placed in affluent circumstances, she never ate the bread of idleness. She stretched out her hands to the poor. She embraced every proper occasion to show that it was more blessed to give than to receive. So, how beautiful. So here's the Ames family crypt, and all the details can make even good Halloween reading if you're into morbid topics or you want to know how funerals occurred, wake and then a funeral. This is the most detailed funeral I've ever seen described, because a lieutenant in Jedediah Huntington's regiment wrote every single moment down. He talks about going into the crypt the night before the funeral. He talks about what the wake setup is like, the music, the prayers, the furniture, who's there, why they're there. Sign of the Declaration of Independence, William Williams is there. He thought he was going to marry Faith. She said, no, I'm marrying Jedediah Huntington. He came to her funeral anyway, all the way from Connecticut. Here's the crypt. It's been unmarked ever since she was buried. She is not the only person buried in the crypt. It's the Ames family crypt. Why the Ames never labeled it, we don't know. So I'm working with the local cemetery to say, gee, could we get the Massachusetts DAR and other elements involved so that we could put a plaque there to remember her? Because they said this is completely fascinating. I have the original Purple Heart of George Washington here just to symbolize that in a way she was the first casualty of war of any woman in the American Revolution. Here's Pam standing next to the crypt so you get an idea of the size, location, and condition. This is their son, Jabez, born in 1767. He will visit the grave by 1779 while getting inoculated for smallpox. So if he's visiting with some family members, why didn't they mark it? Guess I'll have to wait and ask God when someday I'm allowed to get to heaven. I don't know. But the widow's grief and the son's grief are tremendously profound. And I just show Pam here. You can imagine what the son and the husband are going through. And it takes me back to Bunker Hill again, and you'll see why as I weave this all together. This is Battle of Bunker Hill, arguably one of John Trumbull's most famous paintings. This version hangs at Yale. The big version, the final version, hangs in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda with 3 others of his. This is done by Don Troiani, who I just met for the first time last week in Southbury. This is what it really would have looked like. This is stylized to the period to show key characters like Israel Putnam and others, Thomas Knowlton. This is a more accurate view of what it would have looked like. The parapet atop the hill, the earth mounds that were built overnight. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. And we have Wethersfield's own Samuel Webb in my book who tells the story. And I don't have my glasses with me, so I guess I'm going to squint and try to do this. Captain John Chester co-writes the letter with Samuel Webb. And they write it to Joseph Webb describing the battle. And here it is. Cambridge, Massachusetts, April 18th, 1775. It would have been June 1775. Dear brother, the horrors and devastations of war now begin to appear with us in earnest. Last Friday afternoon, orders were issued for 1,800 of the province of Massachusetts men and 200 of Connecticut men, including 30 from Captain Chester's company, to parade themselves at 6 o'clock. By the way, Chester's regiment, if you didn't know, were rare for having uniforms. They were blue and with red facings. And there received their orders. Near 9 o'clock, they marched and went entrenching at Bunker's Hill. Here they worked and had a very fine fortification, which the enemy never knew until the morning. They then began a most heavy fire from Copp's Hill in Boston and from all the ships that could fire in the play. About 1 p.m., it was at Cambridge where I heard that the regulars were landing, meaning the British. Because remember, it's British against British. This is a British Civil War. We haven't declared independence yet. So they say the regulars, the redcoats, were landing from their floating batteries. And the alarm was sounded, and we were ordered to march directly down to the fort at Charleston. Before our company could possibly get there, the battle had begun in earnest, and cannon and musket balls were flying about our ears like hail. What an image. A hotter fire you could not have an idea of. Our men were in fine spirits. Your brother, Sam Webb, and I led them, and they kept their order very finely, 2 and 2. At this point, Samuel takes over to write the rest of the letter. Captain Chester is called off and begs me to go on with the letter. On our march down, we met many of our worthy friends wounded, sweltering in their blood. We pushed on and came into the field of battle. Through the cannonading of the ships, the bombs, the chain shot, the ring shot that would whirl like this, double-headed shot fire as thick as hail, but thank heaven, few of our men suffered. We mounted Bunker Hill and descended into the field of battle and began our fire very briskly. The regulars, that is the British, in great plenty. But we keep a good front and stood their ground nobly. Twice before we arrived, they gave away, meaning the British had failed in 2 assaults, as you probably know. But it wasn't before long before our numbers were mounting in the walls of our fort on Breed's Hill. We were running out of course, ammunition. And our men on the fort were ordered to fire and make a swift retreat. We covered their retreat until they came up with us. Dead and wounded lay on every side of me, their groans very piercing indeed. That is Sam on the right. Back to children of Patriots in the wartime. So Jedediah is going through the grief of how his wife felt in the wake of this same battle at Bunker Hill, not taking her life till months later. Jabez is only 10 years old, roughly. He's not even that. He's 8 years old, and he's going to write a letter. And here he is. He's going to go to Yale and graduate at 15 years old. And here's what he writes when he's 8. I'm one of the first people to transcribe one of his letters. I think it was this one I transcribed. And I cried as I transcribed it. Honored Father, as I know it will give you pleasure to hear from your little boy, I take this opportunity to inform you that I am well and pleased to hear by Mama, this was June of 75, of your welfare, and I pray God to preserve your life and health amidst the dangers which surround you and to bring you home again in safety. I long to see you, for I know you and Mama are my best friends I have in the world. I shall therefore cheerfully follow your advice. How sweet. He's painted by Uncle Jack on the very staircase where Uncle Jack fell, around the same age as his subject. I'm convinced that's why he painted it there. It's a trauma bond. One has lost his parent, the other one lost his eyesight. It's an incredible bond. This is Uncle Ebenezer Huntington, the second owner of our house. He's also in the siege of Boston. He is at Dorchester's Heights, a miraculous intervention of weather that allows fog to intervene in a snowstorm or something, and the British can't even attack Dorchester Heights, which would have turned into another Bunker Hill. And here's Captain Ebenezer Huntington, who later will rise all the way to a major general. And he writes to his father in January of 1776, Ebenezer, to his father Jabez, my clothes and papers are properly secured in a case. My Maker should, in his great good pleasure, should ordain I should not live to come off the hill. Pray that we may succeed as we may trust that we are fighting the Lord's battle. So he was confronting his mortality in his own Christian terms there. He would survive the entire war, including being at the siege of Yorktown and put into his brother-in-law's painting that hangs at the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. And this painting is of him as a general, done by his brother-in-law, John Trumbull. I'm going to begin wrapping up in the next few slides here. Jed Huntington has a surgeon, and it's Albert Waldo, and he has some of those poignant quotes in his diary. This one's just incredible. The scene is famous, Valley Forge. You can imagine the huts. There's probably a foot of snow on the ground. And he says, I was called to relieve a soldier thought to be dying. He expired before he reached the hut, but he was an Indian, an excellent soldier, and an obedient, good-natured fellow. He engaged for money, doubtless as others do, but he has served his country faithfully. He has fought for those very people who disinherited his forefathers. Having finished his pilgrimage, he was discharged from the war of life and death. His memory ought to be respected more than those rich ones who supply the world with nothing better than money and vice. Wow, what a poignant quote. So timely. Sergeant Joseph Plum Martin figures very importantly in his dark humor at Valley Forge. He says when the beef finally showed up, they could finally have a meal that was actually meat instead of hardtack. He said, yeah, this cow showed up and it was lean. It would have made a mighty fine lantern for all the light that was shining through it. Wow. Here he is as a sergeant later on in the war at Yorktown, and photographed he and his wife in the 1840s. He writes the most famous memoirs of the American Revolution. It's basically called Private Yankee Doodle. You can get it as a $5 paperback. He complained in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, people were already forgetting the sacrifices that his heroic generation had made. They were the greatest generation. They'd created the United States. Lafayette had come through. That did remind people in 1824 and 25 the importance of the American Revolution. And yet, remote towns, not famous people like Lafayette, like Joseph Plum Martin, what about us? And that's his point, as he has with his dark humor. I love that he and his wife were photographed. And very sweet. We were on a trip up in Maine years ago, and we did a prayer there at his grave, which is right off Route 1. So imagine standing next to the Celestine Highway with all the cars whizzing by, and this cemetery, which overlooks a bay near Castine in coastal Maine, has a church across the street, but in between these plots and the church is Route 1. And there, but there we were, saying our little prayer amongst the noise. So back to Bunker Hill and John Trumbull. This is one of his most famous paintings, The Death of General Warren at the Battle of Bunker's Hill. It's at Yale and other locations, including Wadsworth. Wadsworth has an earlier version. Can't close this talk without mentioning probably his most famous painting. It's on the $2 bill. You might remember the esoteric $2 bill with Thomas Jefferson. This is on the back. Connecticut's own Roger Sherman joins John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and Edward Ludwig in proposing to John Hancock the draft of the Declaration of Independence. Did everyone sign on July 4th? No. Samuel Huntington won't sign it until around August 6th. So just be aware, not everyone signed it that day. But this was a beautiful moment, and John Trumbull wanted to cram everyone in because not all 56 signers were there that day, but he wanted everyone to have a catalog of what it could have looked like had they all been in the room at the same time. One of my last slides here is John Trumbull's religious art. It hardly ever gets talked about. We always talk about these paintings in our secular world, and yet John Trumbull actually did a lot of religious paintings at the beginning of his career, sprinkled in a little bit, and then returned to it later in his career as he's facing his wife's mortality and then his mortality. This is an Old Testament scene, Joshua at the Battle of Ai, I guess it's pronounced. 1840, he paints it. Obviously an Old Testament scene, quite dramatic. That's at Yale, and of course, in storage. Likewise, also in storage, because it's John Trumbull, is the painting of his wife having her near-death experience on her deathbed, raising her arm up. And in talking with a couple Christian historians, they mentioned, it seemed to be a little bit of a fad to have that moment and talk about what was it they were seeing and experiencing. And I think we would too, right? Here she is on her deathbed. They had no children together. The only child that John Trumbull ever had was out of wedlock years prior, and that boy, whose mother was from Connecticut and who was a servant, the boy would grow up and serve as an aide to General Duke de Wellington. Wellington famous, for fighting Napoleon at Waterloo. And so there's a painting of his son, but it's not by John Trumbull. So that's interesting in itself. So I'll close, before my final slides, to say Brigadier General Samuel Webb of Wethersfield. Now, spoiler alert, when you go see my book, if you haven't already, it ends in 1779 because I have to cut the text in half. I can't have the whole war. So the second book picks up where the first one leaves off. It's just like a TV series. And so it picks up just as the ship is headed out to sea. We don't know where it goes. Second book, you find out, it goes to fill in the blank city. When it's leaving, it does what modern submariners do when they leave the port at the Groton subbase. It'll say classified, and it's a piece of plastic, and you break the plastic, and it tells the skipper, the commander of the ship, this is where you're going to be deployed. This is where you're going. Could be Iceland, could be Saudi, Gulf of Arabia, what have you. The letter that the sea captain has on the USS Confederacy says, do not break the seal until you pass Montauk Light. It's the same thing. People don't change. It's just analog, digital, whatever. So here is Sam Webb. Later in life, he had moved to New York City. Why am I mentioning him at the end? Because it comes full circle at Wethersfield. This is near the end of my second book. He's holding the Bible for George Washington at his inauguration as president. Pretty magical. He's the Grand Marshal and Master of Ceremonies. There's no Bible to be found an hour before the service begins. So Sam says, I know what to do. And he runs down to St. John's Lodge down the street, grabs the Bible from the Masonic Lodge, and brings it up. I'm one of the few people who has not officially held the Bible, but maybe I did, with the Park Service permission. And he says in his letter to his wife, Catherine, he wrote, the event was attended, quote, by the greatest concourse of citizens that I have ever beheld. I mean, the noise and it was just quite the scene. There's Henry Knox in his uniform. What did Washington wear? The suit that you can go see at Connecticut Museum of History, and that is the brown suit, because Washington insisted on homespun. He wanted very simplistic suit, and it's a brown felt suit. So I'll wrap up by reminding you, here's the cover of my book, and if you want me to break down one more time, I will say my born-again experience, but I have no idea what time it is, because I didn't keep track. So if you have 2 more minutes, I'll tell you this story, and then I would like to take some questions before we depart. So here we go. In synopsis form. I think it's 2011. I call this my head-to-toe story. God literally healed me from head to toe, figuratively, not literally. So this is the first time I've ever shared this story, certainly being recorded, and definitely outside of anything besides a living room of my house or a friend's. I don't know, I'd have to go back and look at my diary and see if it was the same year. I believe, as I recollect, I know that it was early in 2011 that I had an incident that was very much, I felt, a Saul to Paul or Old Testament Joshua kind of experience. Pam had gone to sleep, and I'm at my house, and I'm having strange thoughts. Telepathy starts to kick in. I'm having conversations. I'm having conversations with my deceased parents and my deceased in-laws. So the next day, I was able to say to Pam, I got to meet your dad. And she said, that's amazing, because he had died of cancer in 1988 in California. I said, yeah, well, he's happy, because I saw flowers, and I saw them happy for us. And if we go back to Jay Deifelin here, we were here without our parents. Our 4 parents had already died, and yet we were introduced by her mom and my dad, who were both Yale alumni. And so we were matched in March of 2000, finally could start dating in 2002 when I returned from teaching in Louisville. Again, wait for God's timing, like, why am I leaving my job? Why am I coming home? Well, literally it's because your dad's not doing well, he's dying of heart disease. How would I have known that that would lead to being married to Pam? And then we're here. And then it's like, wait for God's timing, your mom lived her dream to be able to go to Yale Divinity School later in life. We never thought that would happen until 1990s. Same thing for me. Okay, so now the floor is disappearing. I'm talking to mom and dad and everybody else. I'm sitting in a chair in a living room and the floor is disappearing. God said to me, this is my feeling, a voice, and I feel it's God. Do you want to go on a journey? And my answer to him was, no, this is enough. This is pretty cool. Okay. But I was thinking as it was happening of, was it Joshua who saw the chariots? And I thought of all these scenes. I said, now I know what it's like to be someone who had gone through an Old Testament experience and just was suddenly struck by this supernatural experience. That wasn't the end of it. I had a perfectly normal day the next day. And then I had another weird day that I won't go into now, but let's just say my mind was compromised. God took the greatest gift that I had, was my intellect, and I couldn't think for several hours. And at the end of it, I could barely even know that Pam was in front of me. And Pam was worried as a psychologist, what's going to be happening? Well, the doctor I eventually coordinated with, he said, we know something happened. We tested your brain. Yeah, we did the scans and all that. Something happened. We cannot describe it. Those were his words. I'm like, that's all I need to know? And it was really wild to have my mind back and be able to be fully restored. And so that's the first time I've ever shared all of that with you, except there's part 2, or I guess it's 3, because that's my head. But remember, I said to toe. I had this horrible case of plantar warts on my right foot because I had been a coach of crew at a prep school. And there was just one time I used that shower in the locker room, and that's the time I would get the plantar wart? Great. I put it off. I was going to get around to it. The infection got worse and worse. I went to one doctor. He said, yeah, we'll get around to it. Just put some acid here. That wasn't working. Then I kind of just said, okay, whatever, and I stopped looking. Then one morning, Christmas morning, here at our house in Wethersfield, God said, you ought to look at your foot. Okay. So before I step into the shower, I go like this. Nothing. Completely healed. No scars even from the plantar warts. And I mean, I thought I was going to lose maybe a toe or two over this stuff. It's terrible. I have the pictures to prove it. I come downstairs to Pam. I said, she goes, wait a minute, your foot looks fine. I said, yeah, hold on. She goes, show me your other foot, because that can't possibly be. I said, oh, wait till you see the other foot. They match. Pam goes, how the heck could that possibly happen? I said, well, it's another miracle, Pam. So there it is. So thank you again for this beautiful opportunity to be here this evening, for all of you to sit here on this warm evening and have this experience. Hopefully someday somebody will be watching this who isn't even alive, watching this on YouTube. You'll see in the back of the book I have an AI image of me looking like a founding father. So you have to have a sense of humor and creativity. Before we depart, is there any questions anyone wants to ask before we head in? Yes, sir.
What did they do for work in the olden days, and what else did he paint?
So John Trumbull did all kinds of different subjects. He would paint a lot of George Washington, and a lot of them were commissioned by local governments. So a state government would commission him, municipalities, as far as careers of various people. Now, he himself also served a little bit as a diplomat and as a merchant, because his father was a prominent merchant. The most prominent thing that people did professionally in that era was farm. Farming, well over 60% of the population in that era. Second to that would have been everything else combined. Whether you were helping build a house, work as a merchant, banking, what have you, wheelwright, that sort of thing, blacksmith, those are your different things that are common to the period, like the cooper, the guy who made the barrels. Christy.
You heard the rumors about the fall of John Trumbull down the stairs, how maybe it really didn't happen. I've been hearing these rumors in the last year.
So my problem with the question is, have you heard the rumors might be refuted about him falling down the stairs? My problem with that is then you're questioning John Trumbull himself, because he says this in his memoirs. Why in 1838, when he's world famous, does he have to make up a story that he's blinded by falling down the staircase and blind in one eye? There's no material gain in that. And actually your questioner is reminding me that Pam had reminded me to explain to you all just a little, I wouldn't call it public service announcement, just a recap as we go into the 250th, is to remember when we have, it's not to say that all of these stories are to be refuted or all of them are to be, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but when it comes to the founding fathers were not Christians, or we were not a Christian country. Yes, it's beautiful that George Washington had the Truro Synagogue Agreement, which he said, respect people of all religions. And so Jews were welcome to practice. I mean, my goodness, we had Quakers who said we're not even going to fight in the war, to the point where the British said, hey, you guys are really strange, okay? Quakers didn't get along with anybody because they were such extreme pacifists. So we had diverse places like Rhode Island, Eastern Mass, places like that, even here. And so we had religious diversity, but we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, well, gee, all the founding fathers were just a bunch of, deists or something. There were two, Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin. Everybody else, Christian, saying we're going to open with a prayer. And we know there was that movie that came out a couple months ago where Ben Franklin was close friends with the famous minister. Was it Reverend Witherspoon? Whitfield, yeah. Fascinating movie. So we just want to recap saying every time you hear secular modern United States saying secularism, founding fathers, not Christian, so forth, I came up with so many different examples in my book in which clearly they felt there was divine providence in some way helping guide the American Revolution, protect them through difficult times, especially George Washington's physical well-being. I mean, the guy would be out there with bullets flying all around him, and it's like, how does the guy not get wounded or killed? Same thing happened in the French and Indian War, but why is this guy not getting killed? Famously, Battle of Princeton, he's galloping back and forth, and the bullets are just... And we're targeting the British leaders. Make no bones about it. That was famous for us with the Ferguson rifle at the Battle of Saratoga. Washington doesn't get hit. One guy even is aiming his rifle. I don't think it was Ferguson. I think it was another rifle. He said, I can't take the shot. I just can't do it. And so you wonder. But that doesn't mean George Washington is flawless. We're all human. We all, he had his business deals and he owned slaves and so forth. But it's very interesting to look at all of them as complex individuals who happen to believe in God and divinity of Jesus Christ. So I just like to remind people of that as a back thing. And that John Trumbull had to wrestle with that he had his paintings and he came from this very religious family. And we have to convey that in some way that's understandable for us when we talk about him here in Connecticut, that John Trumbull isn't just remembered as a painter, but he was a man of very strong faith who must have suffered PTSD from the horrors that he saw. I wasn't going to get into them, but he saw horrible things at the Battle of Rhode Island in August of 1778. In modern times, he would have gone exactly to a shrink like Dr. Hall to say, I need to work on my PTSD, because the guy saw, people getting seriously wounded in weird ways is the only way I'm going to say it. I'll leave it that way. And he had even seen it beforehand. He saw a guy next to him who he was standing there breathing next to him, hit by a cannonball, and then didn't move. He just stopped breathing because the wind had the cannonball knocked the wind out of him, and he died from the shock of it. But they couldn't tell. They couldn't see any of the internal bruising. It was all internal. It wasn't like he had lost a limb. So he said it was, at that time, this is 1775, the most bizarre thing he had ever seen in a combat setting. So I've gone long past whatever time I had in mind, so I will follow you now to the community room where there's ice water and copies of our book if you'd like to meet and greet. Thank you again, everyone. By the way, one final thing, yes. The colonial way to say thank you. I will be speaking, there's the secular talk, it won't be anything like tonight's, at places like Webdean Stevens. Webdean Stevens, I was rescheduled from this last week to next month, a date to be determined. So and you can watch me on YouTube and all the other stuff and see me doing various segments and versions of this talk. There's just a naval portion alone that takes 2 hours in 2 one-hour segments on YouTube if you'd like to see it. Thank you.